on AIDS. And I was absolutely astonished to find that the population of Africa south of Sahara has doubled during the AIDS epidemic. That's totally contrary to everything I'd learnt. Then a doctor said to me, "Do you know they diagnose AIDS differently in Africa from how they do it in the United States?" And I was shocked. I mean, you can't diagnose a disease differently and give it the same name. And they said, well, it's easy to discover. It goes to the World Health Organization, and they've put it on their website, how to diagnose AIDS in Africa. Well, I know Times journalists, many leading journalists, and I asked them, and they said, no, rubbish, no. They can't do it differently in Africa. Well, they do. They've got up on their website, anyone can go to the World Health Organization website and look up what's called a diagnostic definition of AIDS for Africa. It's called the Bangui definition. And it says that Africans have to score 12 points and need not be proved HIV positive. If they've got diarrhea for a month, that counts as 4 points. Impure water supplies. If consequent to having diarrhea for a month, they've got 10% weight loss, 4 points. Intermittent fever, 4 points. Dermatitis, a skin rash, 3 points. Okay, here's an African. 60% of the Africans live in such poverty south of Sahara that they do not have pure water supplies. That would give them diarrhea, that would give them weight loss, that would give them dermatitis, that would give them intermittent fevers. But this is down, it's on the South African diagnostic documents given to their doctors, same documents given out in Kenya, same documents given out in Uganda. It's all set out, tick, tick, tick the boxes, score 12 points, this African has got AIDS. You then tell them, a young man, young woman, and you say, you have got a sexually transmitted, which often means lots of guilt, disease, and you're surely going to die unless you can persuade your government to purchase very expensive American drugs. Most of these drugs are making $1 billion a year for American companies. It's just inconsequential. We've got a different diagnosis for Africa. It's stupid. But then if you go to the Centers for Disease Control in Washington and look up the rules for diagnosis of AIDS, it also lists ways of diagnosing AIDS in the HIV negative. There's about 12 different ways of being found to have AIDS in the United States without being HIV positive. And at the same time, they say HIV is necessary for AIDS. I do not understand my own profession. I don't understand why my fellow journalists do not go to the World Health Organization to find out how to diagnose AIDS in Africa. It's simply presumed and logical. They think they do it the same as they do it in the United States. But you know, it was politically necessary in a way because viruses are gender neutral in who they infect men and women likewise. So, if it wasn't for Africa, we'd have to say that AIDS is a male disease, because AIDS is nearly totally striking down men and not women. They conceal this by giving figures and percentages, but when you get the actual statistics, I'm from the UK, last year's government figures, 47 women and 5,000 men. Also in Africa, the World Health Organization, to save money, extrapolates from the figures that they've done at at the clinic. We know from the manufacturers of the HIV test that pregnancy is a risk factor for testing positive. So they take the figures from the pregnancy clinics in South Africa and they multiply them up to make a figure for the entire country. And yet, currently, the South African government this AIDS right down below about 5 or 6 other diseases as a killer in Africa. This has outraged the AIDS lobby, and now claiming all the people dying of TB are dying of AIDS, in order to be able to say that and TB is a big killer. So they're fixing the figures. I went to the stage at, I staged with other journalists in Johannesburg. I had the Times correspondent antiretroviral drugs, and we come out to give them to Africans. And I thought, well, what do I say? I don't want to start a big argument. So I simply cited a professor at Harvard who has reported that microbacteria test positive for HIV. And the reaction was, "What you say? What's that?" And I said, well, the theory of AIDS demands that. And he said, "You said the theory." She says the theory. And it was like I was being ridiculed for quoting a Harvard University professor. And I said, well, what it means is that anyone with TB will test positive. And therefore, they should not be given antiretroviral drugs. And that was almost like I was saying that there was no God in heaven, that I committed heresy. Everywhere I went in South Africa, there were adverts up saying, "Sweet 16, HIV wants to sleep with you." Everywhere. Forcing governments to spend their money on antiretroviral drugs, not spending it on clean water supplies. Other scientists that were researching malaria found they were starved of money because all the money is going into AIDS. And any doctor worth their salt in Africa now who wants to get funding for their practice has to say that their patients have got AIDS, which is really easy if you define it so broadly. Any patient who wants money has to say they've got AIDS if they want money. The whole social welfare and medical system in Africa has been bent by this. It's just atrocious to see it. I mean, even in my practice where I go for my own personal doctor in England, the nurse I see is a former African specialist. She's out there in Africa, and she was telling me how she was absolutely starved of funds because she wasn't treating AIDS patients, she was treating malaria patients, and she couldn't get funding. And this
there's another aspect to this as well. Look at every country in Africa. If Africa is infectious and it's sexually transmitted, then it should be everywhere. Why is it that in the more prosperous nations in Africa, you don't have the AIDS epidemic? You continue to see it where you have refugee camps, where you see poor people, where they don't have clean water, they don't have good nutrition, yes. They're suffering from multiple parasitic infections, they have tuberculosis because they're in close proximity to other people in these camps, and yet they will use the numbers from a camp and so state that it represents a whole area. And it doesn't. And unfortunately, this is where the pharmaceutical interests have total control. And then they end up influencing the Bill Gates and Bill Clintons, and then the people who support raising money for African AIDS causes. And if you really want to help AIDS in Africa, then set up clinics to treat people for malnutrition, malaria, tuberculosis, schistosomiasis, and that will help them. In fact, we contacted the National Institutes of Health, and I said, I'd be willing to take 100 persons that you diagnose with full-blown AIDS, and we will work with them for 6 months, where you take their blood chemistry, and see how well they do at the end of 6 months compared to a group given your antiretrovirals. Didn't want to take that. Didn't want that challenge. Until such time that we have more scientists challenging the medical editors at Science magazine. I get it back to this. You're going to have to take this debate to the magazines, because they're the ones that give credibility to this whole hypothesis. It is my request that write to the editors of Science magazine and Nature magazine and the New England Journal of Medicine, the American Medical Association magazine, Journal of the American Medical Association, the British Medical Journal, and the Lancet. Challenge them say, why won't you allow a guest editorial with documentation that would prove that, that there is lacking science in the discovery of the HIV virus? And if she can't provide them with that proof, then let them challenge her, let them discredit her.
And my films have been shown on the BBC at peak periods. But if you go on the BBC website, I'm ashamed to say that it's got a large section on HIV science, which actually says end of debates. So I open up the debate section. There is no mention of a single scientist who calls HIV into question. I have friends who have tried to post stuff on the BBC website, and it is deleted if it questions HIV. This is against medical ethics. It confronts the basic principles that you make. I've worked on Panorama, major prestige British programs. It's a conflict of journalistic ethics not to report two sides of a debate. It has to be done. This is being violated constantly by Newsnight and all our top programs.
So the American media, the British media, the French media, media around the world are culpable to special interest groups, advertisers, but let's ask for debate. Let's ask for dialogue. Do we have questions from people in the audience? Please give them to us. And anyone in this audience who would like to address the world, address this issue, the forum is open. Please come forward and we will take your questions. All right, here's two questions from Walter from Arlington, Virginia. If AIDS is not a virus, how did healthy people like Arthur Ashe and Magic Johnson contract AIDS? What could have caused them to get sick?
I don't know the personal circumstances.
Okay, well, I certainly will give you this. Arthur Ashe was not healthy. He had nearly died. If you remember, he had massive heart operation. And therefore, he was taking mildly depressed. So it would have been very easy for him to have cross-reacted to an HIV antibody test, again, which is non-specific. There are over 70 different conditions that you could have, including the measles, including flu. If you get a flu shot, you could test positive. And then put on the medication. Now, I met Arthur Ashe. Arthur Ashe came into my clinic multiple times. And he would sit there for hours on end and speak with the people who were getting the holistic lifestyle modification. He would look at their medical records. He would speak with the physicians. And he was very interested, but he said that he did not want to disappoint his doctors by trying this therapy. Even on Tony Brown's journal, he sat with me on national television when I discussed what a holistic model was and the limitations of the existing model. And he said he would try it. He never tried it. But Arthur Ashe was extremely ill and had major surgery. One second. As far as, I'll come right to you. As far as Magic Johnson, keep in mind that when you have sex and you have any kind of virus or bacteria, if that cross-reacts, you can be given a diagnosis and still be healthy. Or you could have hepatitis. You could have herpes. You could have any number, 70 conditions, and test positive. I was contacted after Arthur Ashe by someone close to him and asked for a holistic protocol, which I was happy to give them. But at that time, we didn't know that you could cross-react. That would come out later based upon the outstanding work of Christine, what's her last name? Christine Johnson? Yeah. Who? No, Johnson. And who showed that all these, and by that, at that time it was 45 things you could cross-react. Now it's over 70. Now this is in peer-reviewed literature. So the assumption is that you have nothing in your body that could cause you to have this. And let me also mention, many, many, many times in Africa, completely normal lifestyle, heterosexual women who've never had sex ended up being diagnosed with AIDS because of other lifestyle factors like malaria, tuberculosis, malnutrition, and put on the AZT or the other drugs, DDI, DDC, protease inhibitors, etc. But they're also shamed. Even when they've been shown, even women who've been shown that they were virgins were still told that somehow they must have had sex. And we forget that the majority of the people in Africa hold sex in a different manner than we do in the United States. They are not liberal about their sexuality. It's a very sacred process. So we've condemned in the almost colonial racism a nation is all having sex, and therefore safe sex ads and safe sex programs with condoms, even among virgins. So there's so much bad science on this.
Gary,
Yes.
blood transfusions were alluded to being Arthur Ashe's reason for internally having AIDS.
That's correct. He
Well,
had multiple.
when you say other aspects, here a person could be a fine athlete and, you know, a role model, and all of a sudden be an AIDS victim, and to get improper blood into one's system is equivalent to having unprotected sex and having some breakage of the flesh such that the AIDS, whatever, could enter the body. But
Well,
the
it's
point I
not-
wanted to make is that you could be innocent of any activity, you mentioned the word virgins, that you could get a blood transfusion of improper blood and be a victim.
You're absolutely correct. We have an example of individuals who got a flu vaccine and gave blood and tested positive because the flu vaccine cross-reacted. People who had nothing wrong with their lifestyle and then were grossly depressed. Depression itself will lower your T cells. Training for a marathon will lower your T cells. Chronic stress will lower your T cells. So if you just measure the T cells in a chronically stressed person or a depressed person, you could diagnose them as having markers that would qualify them for being diagnosed with AIDS, and that's the danger. Now, in another situation here, bad blood in transfusions can give you hepatitis. And for decades, drug addicts and derelicts were getting money by going in 2-3 times a week and selling their blood. Those were not isolated. They were not destroyed. They were put into the general blood pool, and unknown numbers of Americans in the hospitals receive blood transfusions, end up with hepatitis or herpes 6. And the outstanding work of two of the best journalists in America, Nina Ostrom, the New York Native, and Charles Ortlieb, the publisher of the New York Native, showed the danger of having human herpes 6 in the system, what it would do to the immune system, causing all the symptoms we call AIDS, and they were dismissed out of hand. Also, once you have hepatitis B or hepatitis C, you can cross-react and test positive, which is probably what happened according to what he said with Arthur Ashe. Thank you for your comments. We have, this is from Diane from New York. When Gallo made his discovery, who was employing him? He was he motivated simply by his desire for a significant discovery? What was the National Cancer Institute?
He was a government paid scientist working for the government at that time.
United States government?
United States government in Washington, D.C. I've been to where he works, the National Institutes of Health in Washington.
Be seemingly better, but it's an enormous cost. It'd be like staying up for 5 nights in a row by taking caffeine. You might be awake, but you're going to pay a price. And now we see the deadly price of these antiretrovirals. So when someone says to me, well, there's a healthy black woman, let's take a look and see what that woman, did she ever have herpes, hepatitis, measles, diabetes, arthritis? Because those are just some of the conditions that a regular person could get tested and get a false reaction. And how many people know that they have hepatitis? I counseled 5 women in their 50s, healthy, affluent, educated. All of them had fatigue. When we tested their blood, they all had hepatitis. They didn't know how they got it, they didn't know when they got it, but they had it. When we worked on the hepatitis, they got better. So you need to know that there are a lot of things can test you positive.
If I could just add on this one here, I don't know from the questionnaire whether the person was sick at the time they were, and if they went on to antiretroviral drugs. Because I do know from American government sources that over 60% of the people going on to what is chemotherapy, the same drugs are prescribed against cancer, 60% of these are totally healthy at the time. They've got no outward signs of illness at the time they put on the drugs. We've changed the definition of AIDS 4 times in the last 20 years in the United States. At the beginning, you had to be dying to be given an AIDS diagnosis. You had fungal pneumonia and you had very bad candida. Your prognosis was from 8 to 14 months. Today, if you've got a low number of CD4 cells, you're said to be ready to go on to antiretroviral drugs. One of the studies I've read recently is from a major hospital. It went around all its seriously ill patients and tested their CD4 cells and how many they had. They found and reported no correlation at all between prognosis or how serious the illness was and the number of CD4 drugs. There was nothing there. Basically, it's part of what I was saying before, the body can change CD4s into CD8s. Because CD8s are the natural killer cells. When you've got a pathogen in your blood and your blood wants to get rid of it quick, it doesn't need the helper cells so much as the killer cells. So it changes the CD4s into CD8s. Okay, CD8s drop right down a number, and up go your CD8s. Your body is striking back. That's all it can mean. And they've also found an enormous range. There are people climbing the Alps with CD4 cells in their blood.
Oh, let me give you an example. Over 12 years ago, to challenge the idea that low T cells under 200 in and of itself could give you a diagnosis of AIDS, I tested the blood of all the people that I was training to do the New York City Marathon. We were within a week of doing the marathon. We'd been training for 9 months. Vegetarians, no smoking, no drinking, no unhealthy sex, really healthy people. Every single one of us had under 200 T cells. That was what was happening. Now that, but after the marathon and after a 2 months rest, T cells back up anywhere from 800 to 1600. So when you consider how many things can drop your T cells, and yet that was the big thing for a long time, number your T cells. I've seen people who've had 1 or 2 T4s and were outstandingly healthy. They put too much emphasis on that. Now, this is an important question for you. This is from Gary K., and he says, this is for Janine. Did you contact Gallo or Popovic on the documents discovery? Where did you obtain these documents, and how were they not revealed until now? 3 good questions. Thank you, Gary K.
3 good questions. Gallo contacted me because when I was doing this research, I put out to numbers of scientists, quite a large number of scientists, my research notes, my draft articles, the chapter of my book. And Robert Gallo himself sent me a half-page email, densely packed, half-page, full page, in terms of how much was in it, attacking me, saying I clearly wasn't interested in the truth, totally ignoring. I sent him details on these papers. I told him that I'd found this report with all the changes in his handwriting. He didn't even comment on that. What he did complain about was I also said that the Secret Service investigated him in '93, the Secret Service whose responsibility is to protect the American presidents. It investigated Robert Gallo for fraud, and he denied it. He said, no, this never happened. Well, he said that to the wrong person. I've interviewed I've met high-up people in the CIA, I've met KGB generals in Moscow, Mossad, Israeli intelligence. I know the intelligence community. 2 days later, I was talking to the former head of the Secret Service, who's now in retirement, and he was personally in charge of the investigation into Robert Gala. It seems that Robert Gala had to provide documents to lawyers employed by the French government. The French government wanted to take him to court for stealing their files. So, as the law goes, he had to provide laboratory documents. What the Secret Service did in their very fine laboratory in Washington was test these documents for forgery. And now these documents were each inside a cardboard, a file. So the cardboard file. And they found that they'd all been changed on the same date, leaving an impression on the outside of the file. One of the changes was to rename the file as HTLV3 as HIV. Yet he gave these documents to the lawyers. These documents are dated before the name HIV came into use. It wasn't used before 1986. So he actually quite clearly fraudulent. The evidence was so strong that the congressional investigator, Representative John Dingell, and the Secret Service had these documents presented to a state attorney general for prosecution. And it was ruled out of time because it had taken so many years to uncover this. And therefore, on a technicality, as far as we can judge, he was not prosecuted for this particular fraud. But that's what he said. He says in the email to me, which I've reproduced in my book, I don't believe in hiding anything, so the whole, not censored, the entire attack from him is in the book. And the Secret Service, the guys who will offer testimony, they will say that he's wrong. And I've told Robert Gala that. He has no response at all from him now. I haven't got in touch with Popovic. Popovic was offered a professorship in Robert Gala's new institute in Baltimore. Gala was basically told, I understand, as far as I know, he was told he had to leave the NIH after it was proved he had stolen the French virus. A year later, he set up in Baltimore the IHV, his own institute, not HIV, but altered around, where he is currently advising African governments financed by Bill Gates and the Defense Department. Just 2 years ago, he put out on his website that he got a new idea on HIV. He's still highly influential, this man. He's the guru of the HIV establishment. He put out on his website that anyone who fears that they've had a night of unguarded sex, that they're not trusting their partner, should go on antiretrovirals. A year later, the CDC made this official policy in the United States. It says on the CDC website that a person who is fearful because they suspect their partner or because a condom broke should go on a sharp course, say a month, of chemotherapy, of antiretroviral therapy, in order to stop getting infected. I mean, this is, these are drugs, when we use them against cancer, we watch the patients like a hawk, the hair falls out, we get them off the drugs as soon as possible. These patients are put on them for life. When they die on these drugs, they're said to die of AIDS. The manufacturers warn on one of the drugs used, this drug produces the same body wasting as found in AIDS cases. You see, it's very hard to attack an invisible virus. And this is true of all viruses. We've only got vaccines that give us antibodies, and then we claim that these antibodies stop the virus, or we try to stop the cell from making them. Because every virus that exists is made by cells. They're made by plant cells, fish cells, human cells. They're a natural product that even healthy cells make viruses. We're only now, leading biologists are now coming to understand why they do this. So to simply go from the presence of a virus to say it's the cause of an illness is jumping a very, very big gun. is jumping a gorge. Because, see, our cells need to talk to each other. They need to send genetic codes from one to another. The wonderful Barbara McClintock, Nobel laureate, explained this. She was ridiculed at first. She's an inspiring woman in biology. She didn't get her Nobel laureate prize till she got to her 80s. Because what she had said was that plant cells are intelligent. And when she gave her Nobel laureate speech, she explained what she meant. It seems that all cells, whether they're in us or in plants, are constantly sniffing their environment and changing their DNA to give themselves protection. So tobacco smoke, modern toxins go past, the cell changes its DNA to give itself protection. Every cell, for plant or human, has got 5 feet of DNA that's like gossamer, it's like very fine silk, and it's rolled into the tightest of ball in the center of every cell that exists. And this is leading biology. No one challenged it. 5 feet, tightly encoded in 4s. Computers encode in 2. So these long strands are packed with information. And today our evolutionary biologists are unraveling these codes, because these codes are how we evolved over the last few millions, hundreds of millions of years. Over a third of our genome has been shared between cells, because it's got the fingerprints of retroviruses on it. Because when a cell makes the code it wants, it does it with what is called a retrotransposon, which is like an engineer that's only the size of a molecule. And they are first described by the brilliant Barbara McClintock. They work hard changing the DNA. This is what hospital superbugs do. That's how they protect themselves against drugs in hospitals. But it's how my nose cells do, my fingers, everything does. All cells do this. They adjust their DNA to protect us. Sometimes they will go, eureka, and say, right, we've got the answer. This new bit of DNA is what we need, gives us protection. Now, we're multicellular creatures, and it's silly to say that every cell of our body has to invent the wheel for itself. The next thing that little bit of code has to do is to get to other cells. It adds a small piece of DNA, called an MA domain, to the end of a retrotransposon. That turns it into a retrovirus. Yes, the retrovirus, the same thing that we're blaming on AIDS. The cell then buds it out through its soft membrane, its skin, which is very pliable. Proteins form around it to protect the precious cargo of a lovely new piece of DNA. It goes out into the space between our cells. It's got markers on the outside to tell the cells what it's got inside it. Other cells reach out for it, draw it into themselves, take that precious cargo, and they put it in their inner sanctum. They put it in their genome, in their DNA. They incorporate it. That's how much they trust it, and that's how they've done for the last few 100 million years. And that's why we find 1/3 of our DNA has been transported from cell to cell. It's how we evolved. It's how all creatures evolved. The retrovirus is now being found at the center for human life, for all life on our planet. And this is transforming biology.
And yet this is the very same concept that Gallo and others were looking to say was a pathology, the cause of AIDS. We only have a few minutes left for this part of our discussion. Who else would like to ask a question or make a statement in the audience? Please, Steve.
Just today in the car radio, I heard an announcement that there were some new discoveries about AIDS. And it said that evidence indicates that AIDS is older than we thought, that instead of coming on the scene in about 1930, it's probably earlier from animals.
Looking around for a disease to blame on this virus. But then, unfortunately, he had to take the sample from the French Institute, because his own one, but he still couldn't prove it caused any illness. So he purloined the one from the French.
Let us look at the person who was credited, and is to this day, with the co-discovery of the HIV virus, Luc Montagnier. I have a transcript, and I've watched a film and listened to an audio of him stating that he never fully isolated this virus and that it was not able to kill a lot of T cells. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I am. Dr. Matt, he has since published in several places that he thinks it might have been a mycoplasma or some other agent, that there was need for some other agent to be working alongside HIV on the grounds that HIV didn't seem to be doing the right damage. We've now found a very tiny cell. It's like a jellyfish. It's got very soft cells, sides to it, and it can squeeze through very fine filters, almost to the size that viruses can pass through. So he thinks it could possibly be this tiny cell. Because cells can damage cells, like humans can damage humans. So he now thinks this particular jellyfish-like cell could possibly be a co-agent in causing AIDS. He's also published that it could be stressor agents in the body that are also producing the damage. All this because HIV doesn't seem to be doing the damage which it was said to do right at the beginning. I also should say that the Robert Gallo papers do not mention the transmission of the virus. Afterwards, after they came out, American media universally reported that HIV was spread by sex. I cannot find those papers. Those papers were not there at the time that the newspapers reported this. I think it was briefings, spin, done off camera, you might say, at the time, because they're not in the academic papers.
We are going to open this up now for people over the internet. Give us the call letter on that again.
studio@GaryNull.com.
Studio@GaryNull.com if you would like to address any of the issues stated thus far. Every statement by Janine Roberts is backed up by complete documentation, independently verified as accurate. We are making these documents available on GaryNull.com. We invite members of the scientific community, we certainly invite members of the AIDS dissident community to review these. We are hopeful that some open members, unbiased members of the media will take an honest look. A few points on this. When AIDS was first diagnosed, I had already been working with people in the field, including the leading gay physician in New York City, or at least one of the leading gay physicians treating gay men with a special type of gay bowel disease. It's Dr. Stephen Chiesa. It was his contention that the people were suffering from syphilis and that they needed a special type of aqueous penicillin, one that would pass the blood-brain barrier and help them. But he called me in because he did not know a lot about nutrition, and he asked a basic question. He said he had hundreds and hundreds of patients, all suffering from the same condition. Would I meet with them and see if any form of lifestyle modification might be able to help? I remember in my very first meeting, the room was so packed that nobody could, you couldn't get any more people in. I'm going to guess there were about 50 people in there. And I did 3 subsequent meetings like this. And when I began to ask, what are your symptoms, they were pretty much all the same. Then I asked, is there anything you can think of in your lifestyle that might contribute to your conditions? Without exception, the lifestyle was the key. And after another 3 months of interviewing hundreds of individuals, principally Chiesa's patients, I then ventured down with several of these gentlemen to the West Village and to Christopher Street, which was the heart of the gay renaissance in the United States. As far as sexual revolution, there was the great Stonewall, which is a nightclub there, which is where the gays fought back the police to demand them stop being harassed for their sexual preferences and their lifestyle. And it was the beginning of the gay sexual revolution. It spread thereafter throughout the United States. So I'd never been down to Christopher Street. I'd heard about it, but never been there. And they took me into bars and all forms of places, and I began over a period of time to speak with hundreds and ultimately thousands of individuals who all had something in common. They were all living what arguably would be a very unhealthy lifestyle. This would be typical of 2 of the men who were roommates who took me down there. Both are school teachers. Both had wonderful personalities. They were very healthy. But they would go down there in the evening. They would take massive amounts of antibiotics, generally penicillin, in the misbegotten belief that if they took penicillin before they had sex, unprotected sex, it would protect them from sexually transmitted disease. That's not possible. But that's what everyone believed. And in fact, one of these clubs, there was a jar on the counter with penicillin tablets that some of the doctors who were also participating had put there. I interviewed so many people who had multiple sexual partners in one night. It was not uncommon on a weekend to have people say that they had 15 to 25 sexual partners, different ones. But as anyone knows, you cannot have multiple orgasms. Ask any man. 1 or 2, yes, but not 25. So I said, how are you doing this? And they just smiled and said, well, amyl nitrate, poppers. And I thought this was extremely dangerous. So during the next week, I researched the scientific literature and found that abuse of amyl nitrate, or poppers, can lead to some very serious conditions, including the #1 diagnosed condition of what originally was the AIDS epidemic, and that was pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. It can also lead to conditions. So then you started realizing that the people were also having frequently unprotected anal intercourse, and semen into the bloodstream through the anus by ripping or rupture or tear is very severe to the immune system. It also allows a venue for allowing fecal and contaminated material to go from the colon, rectum, into the bloodstream, again causing a very serious form of septicemia. You also had massive amounts of gonorrhea and syphilis and herpes, including herpes 6 being spread. Many people had 4 or 5 bouts of hepatitis in 1 year. One gentleman I interviewed had hepatitis diagnosed 3 separate times. There also was an experimental or a new form of blood factor that was being used by hemophiliacs at that time, and the hepatitis, I should say, and some of the people believed that they would be protecting themselves by taking this hepatitis B vaccine. Many believed later that that was a principal cause of their immune challenge. There was a lot of smoking and alcohol, and clearly there was sleep deprivation. The 2 gentlemen who worked with me for almost a year, introducing me to people and showing me who was who in this environment, taking me out to the Fire Island, to the Pines. I didn't know the people in the gay community, except the ones in my radio audience, but that was a very, casual relationship. Not on this level. And it was not unheard of for people to finish up their activities at 5 o'clock in the morning, go home, take a shower, get 1 hour's rest, and then off to work. If you took the healthiest Olympian, if you took the man who won all these gold medals, and you deprived him of sleep, only had him allow an hour's sleep, 2 hours of sleep, then you stressed his system, or you gave him antibiotics, in a year he's going to be sick or less. Now put in alcohol, cigarette smoke, put in infections, multiple infections, and it's easy to see how this evolved. At the same time, I was invited to speak before the Vegetarian Gay Society. I didn't know there was such a thing, but the day I lectured, the hall was packed. And I asked, how many of you listened to my radio show? Almost all the hands went up. I said, how many have been tested for HIV? Almost all the hands went up. I said, how many of you tested positive? Hands went down. These were people who their lifestyle, their choice was gay, but they were not participating in what would be known as the fast-track lifestyle. They were not taking drugs. They did have sex, frequently multiple sexual partners. Some had sexually transmitted diseases, but nothing at all remotely associated with what we call AIDS. And to me, that meant that if my hypothesis was right, that it was in the lifestyle, the overwhelming of the body's immune system with amyl nitrate and KY jelly and many at times cocaine. A lot of people use cocaine thinking that it was a natural high to get them through the night. Alcohol and smoking, sleep deprivation, massive parasitic infections, yeast infections, which were absolutely endemic in that movement, that if you reversed all that, you should get these people back to a state of health. So with Dr. Caeza, I started a health modification program Hundreds upon hundreds of individuals were involved in it. And they were put on a vegetarian diet, no alcohol, no caffeine, no artificial sweeteners, no sugars, which feed the yeast. They had to get a good night's sleep. They could have all the sex that they wanted, but they couldn't have unprotected sex, and they couldn't have unhealthy sex, where they exposed themselves or their partner to some form of pathogen. They couldn't take any drugs. They took a lot of supplements. Some had intravenous vitamin drips and other modalities, autohemotherapy, meditation, stress management, and counseling. At the end of about 13 months, all those that participated had made remarkable improvements. Now here's what's important. And there was only one journalist that I could find in the United States interested in this, Tony Brown, the award-winning, highly respected journalist who has a program, the Tony Brown's Journal, on PBS. He invited me to bring these individuals with their medical records showing that they had had full-blown AIDS, that they had only done lifestyle modification, and that they had made the turnaround or improvement. In many cases, full reversal. Now, when I say full reversal, I mean there was no HIV or antibody, there was no pathology at all in their body. None of the 30 designated conditions we call AIDS were present. These people had returned to a normal and vital life. And we had meticulous medical documentation because every month they had to have a full set of blood workups done. And we examined those blood workups and viral loads and everything else. Some of these people, and by the way, no one was charged a penny for any of this. This was all done free. And some of these people were coming into the center 5 days a week, sometimes for 3 to 4 hours. And it was interesting that we put a press release out to at least have an open dialogue to exchange ideas, nothing more, with the mainstream medical community to show that there are people using lifestyle modification and making improvements. There was never this attempt, ever, to tell people don't take the drugs, because I'm a big believer in freedom of choice. There was never a sense of denying AIDS. To the contrary, I can't tell you how many thousands of hours of illnesses and helping them with the illnesses they had, which were very real. But so too was the recovery. So too was the remarkable turnaround. And what was unique was how many of the people who, before they came into this lifestyle modification program, had been in the traditional AIDS support groups, of which there were hundreds, if not thousands. And one person's story was representative of many. They stopped going to the groups because the group members were uncomfortable with the idea that they weren't taking the drugs. Now, they weren't advocating other people not take the drugs, but they were advocating the other people take a healthier lifestyle. And it was interesting how many people were still engaged in an unhealthy lifestyle at the same time taking the unhealthy drugs. And as one man said, he had more than 2,000 people in his health support groups, or his AIDS support groups, in the 5 years before he joined this one, all of whom died. And he said in one group there were over 80 people and every single one died. And he said, do you know what it means when you keep going back and seeing less people and more people dying and realizing you're not? And yet at no point could we get anyone from the National Institutes of Health, anyone at the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease, no one was interested in what we were doing. There was nothing to sell. We were doing what we were doing for free. Our time and energy and counseling and therapeutic models were donated. But there was an enormous backlash by some of the more radical elements within the fast-track gay community. They wanted drugs only. They felt that anyone advocating lifestyle was in denial of AIDS. Not true, but that was their position. And they had the political power to influence legislators, influence public health policy, influence the medical paradigm. And I was just amazed at how there was such a lack of compassion and reason and openness. But that's the way it went. And then I couldn't find any doctors at the time or scientists willing to examine this, except for Kaiser and Dr. Martin Feldman and a few others. And along the way, one by one, over a long period of time, because I can remember when you couldn't find 5 dissident scientists in the United States that would go public. They looked at the evidence. They looked at the evidence and said, how could a virus that we can't find in someone's blood be killing people? And why would we give a very powerful drug, so powerful like AZT, that it can't even be used in cancer? That's where it was originally intended. How could we possibly allow that to be used in AIDS, where people are already sick? If you give a decimated immune system, AZT, you could kill the person. And indeed, people were dying like flies. And yet the medical community refused to change this paradigm. The medical community continued to believe that if they're dying, it's because of AIDS, not because of the treatment. Therefore, give them even more treatment, even more drugs. And I consider this a form of madness. I was embarrassed at the scientific community and the medical community. And then, slowly but surely, we began to see more and more scientists arrive at the same or similar conclusions. So today, the medical community has not cured a single person using this paradigm. We have. If you go to Tony Brown's journal, take a careful look at all the people that we brought on. Their medical records are there, their stories are there, their testimonials are there. When we invited all members of the American press, 7,000 members of the American media, were invited to a press conference to meet 100 people who were long-term survivors of AIDS, who had made remarkable improvements with their physicians, no one showed up. Not a single member of the American media.
Repeat that. There was a little static burst.
We held a press conference that took nearly a year to convene, where 100 individuals from around the United States, using different modalities, but all natural, non-toxic, came together with their physicians, with their medical records, and with a very esteemed group of scientists to discuss this. 7,000 members of the American media were invited. Not one showed up. They were invited on 3 occasions. They still did not show up. So my question then is, what does the American media fear? What did the AIDS establishment scientists fear? In a democratic society, you should also have democracy in science. When science becomes orthodox, it ceases to be science. We need a non-orthodox scientific community. Anything you say today, the first thing a journalist is going to do is call the National Cancer Institute or call one of the AIDS experts who will say that's all nonsense, she doesn't know what she's talking about. They won't even bother to look at your documentation. That's how much fear they have. So needless to say, they are the protectors of the entire orthodoxy. And yet, this is he has 40 years of experience, unblemished record, at the top of her field of going after major causes and being proven right in every single case. And yet, wouldn't you think that 2020, 60 Minutes, Geraldo, Bill O'Reilly, someone in the American media would be interested in inviting her on, challenging her, scrutinizing her documentation, inviting on someone that will offer a legitimate debate and challenge? But that will not happen. Because when it does, the American public could then be exposed to the truth. And what happens when you let that genie out of the bottle? The truth. The American public are smart and sensitive and trusting. It is my personal position that these documents show that the American public has been misled. And I hold this hope that the editors and the journalists associated with Science magazine, the original publishers that legitimized and codified the entire war on AIDS, will re-examine this, and in their good judgment, realizing that new information has been brought to light that must then displace the old information, that we will then begin to see Robert Gallo and other people who have not been offered a challenge be given the challenge that they should. and have an opportunity to defend themselves, have an opportunity to present their points of view, have an opportunity to challenge Janine Roberts. That's what healthy journalism is about. Your point.
Gary, what you're saying is actually brought out, so I wanted to find out what research was unable to be done because these papers were accepted. I went back to the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and their records. I found over 100 papers on poppers, on amyl nitrites, linking it to AIDS. Over 100. One famous doctor, Dr. Blattmer, did an official history of the CDC, Center for Disease Control. And in his history, he talks about the day they announced it was a virus. And he says that day we were having a workshop in the evening, and all over the building people had to rewrite their papers to say it was a virus because they were pointing towards poppers. And unfortunately, it was a very logical thing because they had to find a drug that was being used in the gay community. So they didn't need a drug that was being used by both communities, heterosexual and gay community, because the heterosexuals weren't going down with AIDS. And it was poppers was uniquely the drug that was used in gay sex because it relaxes the smooth muscles, making anal sex more pleasurable. But it also oxidizes the blood and makes it impossible for the blood to carry oxygen. I mean, I've got friends in the gay community, and they told me after 2 weeks on poppers they started getting blackouts. And this is taking poppers frequently. This is breathing poppers, dance floors being sprayed with poppers. Basically because their blood can't carry oxygen, so their mitochondria are starved. What happens? You get cell loss. What happens? You get wasting disease. You get people starting to look like skeletons. Why? Because they can't get oxygen to their cells. Now, when I said earlier about how fungi test positive in the HIV test, just think what I was talking about. It is a respiratory tract that takes in inhaled drugs. Studies in Vancouver, London, LA, all over the place, New York, have all shown 90% correlation with poppers. But it's multi-drugs, 90% correlation also with marijuana, but 60% correlation with crack cocaine, drugs. What if we got damaged cells throughout the whole respiratory tract, not able to absorb oxygen, fungi coming in and devouring the damaged cells, HIV test positive. This is, but I went back on this, it's because finding there was frauds in the HIV papers, you then go, but AIDS really existed. People are dying of AIDS, so what was going on? And that's what took me to
discourage anyone, and wouldn't it be irresponsible to take their medication, but it's which medication and for what conditions and under what way. I mean, tell a diabetic not to take type 1 and type 2 diabetes, not to take their insulin, that could kill them. But you don't tell a diabetic to take a Prozac to help them with their diabetes. So I believe it's the medical paradigm and the drugs offered have been mismanaged and completely wrong. Well, I didn't find anywhere that there was any statistically significant diagnosis of AIDS within the normal gay population. But in the small 2 to 3% of the fast-track population, yes. And you don't find AIDS in the normal heterosexual community. But in the intravenous drug users, you do. Why? They're both immune depressive in their lifestyle. But then if you say it's in the immune system, well, do you have a model in Africa? Yes. I've done 5 multi-award-winning documentaries on AIDS, the latest AIDS Inc. And we have over 30 different places in Africa filmed in these documentaries. There's one very revealing comment by a physician who's a specialist in tropical disease, and he says that he was taken over an orphanage where the children were all AIDS orphans. And yet when he gave them the medicines for their diseases, if they had tuberculosis that you mentioned, if they had malaria, if they were malnourished and gave them good food, clean water, and a nice environment to be in, they reversed and became healthy. Well, how can they be helping people in Africa by cleaning up their environment? How can I be helping overcome this deadly virus with lifestyle modification? If it's this virus that they say is so destructive that no drug has been ever able to kill it, it's too powerful against the drugs, hides in the T cells and everything else, then we have had, in my opinion, the greatest medical fraud in history coming from the entire establishment, in which case now we have to ask well-intentioned men and women in science, medicine, and healthcare to evaluate the evidence, examine the evidence, and then make your conclusions, whatever they may be. Minette Loudon is here. We're going to do something now in this part of our... I wish to make it known that there are now more than 2,000 individuals who challenged the HIV equals AIDS equals death hypothesis. Some of these are the most respected scientists in the world, including multiple Nobel Prize winners. On the one hand, the mainstream medical community can go to 100,000 physicians and say, but we all support HIV causes AIDS and nothing else, and that's it. And then we have to ask them, where's your proof? Where's your scholarship? Well, we have thousands of people who believe that they're wrong over there and that they haven't done their homework. And how did these thousands of people come to be? Because they actually took the time to examine the evidence for themselves and not be propagandized. They didn't jump in with the group and become lemmings in a consensus. These are the best and brightest. And that's why they are dissidents, because they chose not to be spoon-fed anymore. Like Nobel Prize winner Kary Mullis, when they looked for the evidence was not there to allow them to continue to support this hypothesis. I will now read you verbatim quotes from some of the leading scientists in the world and their documentation and qualification, including leading virologists who have a point of view. Not everybody can be here today. We are limited in space and distance. And first we want to acknowledge the outstanding work of David Crow of the Alberta Reappraising AIDS Group and its thousands of members. Also we have Dr. Giraldo here, also formerly director of that same group, who has given us a statement that he also supports the work of Janine Roberts. I spoke with David Crow earlier today, and he went on the record supporting the documents that Janine Roberts has, and now those documents are being disseminated to all of those thousands of leading scientists, and this will be a piece of the puzzle that has been missing, that is crucial. So now I believe in the next month or two that we will have tens of thousands of individuals demanding congressional investigations, but not having the dog and pony show that you historically had on Capitol Hill, where you have a group of pro-HIV equals AIDS people, scientists who are getting money, coming in saying, we're making progress, we need more money, billions more. Okay, here's a blank check. The American public's up in arms because of the $700 billion bailout that Wall Street was given, with no accountability. Well, we will end up spending, if we do not challenge this, that amount of money on AIDS and have nothing to show for it, except a lot of failed science. I might also mention that look at the #1 cause of death in many people with AIDS. It is liver failure, which is not one of the 30 conditions that is causing AIDS. Instead, it is the side effect of the medications. And examine carefully and honestly the science behind AZT. An outstanding researcher, a woman of outstanding and impeccable credentials and character, was a part of the AZT study group at the university. And when she saw that they were excluding people who had died, that the people were pulling their pills and opening up and seeing which were sweet, and therefore the placebo, the lactose, she said, this is a terrible study. It's not a double-blind study. I have read all of her reports to the FDA, and all of her work was thrown aside. When the fix was in that this should be fast-tracked, it was fast-tracked. All dissidents and all decent ethical researchers, and you know who that is, don't you? Lynn Gannett. All right, I'm going to quote individuals that I believe that you should know about. And the next time an Orthodox AIDS person has a say and says, well, there's nobody of credibility, there's nobody of quality, there's nobody who is credentialed who believes all this nonsense. Here are some people who couldn't be here today, but I am going to read, and Minette Loudon is going to read for them. This is from Dr. Hiram Canton, PhD, ethicist, head of the School of Applied Ethics.
Excuse me, Gary, can you repeat that? This is static first.
This is from Dr. Hiram Canton, PhD and ethicist, head of the School of Applied Ethics at Griffith University, Brisbane, Australia. Quote, "The first casualty of the war on AIDS was the integrity of science. The exact moment of the crime, 1984, a press conference where the then U.S. Health Secretary Margaret Heckler declared that government scientist Robert Gallo had discovered the viral cause of AIDS. Heckler held the discovery as, quote, yet another miracle for American medicine and science, and a victory."
Get to pick up from Gallo. That was the first. Did you hear that? Do you know what it could be caused by? Okay. Sometimes there's the police or something.
Okay.
This is from Dr. Gallo.
It was April 1984, press conference where the then Human Secretary Margaret Heckler declared that government scientist Robert Gallo had discovered the viral cause of AIDS. Heckler held the discovery as, quote, yet another miracle for American medicine and science, and a victory over the dreaded disease. If smoke and mirror tricks are miracles, then miracle it was. Neither Gallo nor the Pasteur Institute proved the virus was pathogenic. Indeed, they did not even isolate it, as the Pasteur Institute later admitted. But the spin doctors at the National Institutes of Health had organized leading journals to endorse Secretary Heckler's, quote, miracle with the seal of science. From that moment, all AIDS research and policy were based on a speculation converted to dogma by bureaucratic power. This initial obvious whopper, victory over dreaded disease, into a never-ending sickness saga that extorts money and grinds millions into the muck of bad medicine, be informed. Withdraw your consent from the most malignant fraud ever perpetrated in the name of medicine. Be aware that the primary truth in the war on AIDS is that powerful agencies have declared war on you and your loved ones, regardless of your HIV status. Be aware that AIDS science is 90% mindless repetition and 10% deeply inconsistent findings of no clinical value, unquote. From Professor David Rasnick, biochemist, and he holds 6 patents on the protease inhibitors, the drugs used in AIDS, and was initially a major proponent that HIV equals AIDS and equals death. Quote, in 1990, at the San Francisco AIDS conference, HIV co-discoverer Luc Montagnier announced that HIV did not, after all, kill T cells and could not be the cause of AIDS. Within hours of making this announcement, he was attacked by the very industry he helped to create. The HIV hypothesis of AIDS is the biggest scientific medical blunder of the 20th century. The evidence is overwhelming that HIV is not contagious, not sexually transmitted, or caused by HIV. The physicians who know or suspect the truth are embarrassed or afraid to admit that HIV tests are absurd and should be outlawed, and that the anti-HIV drugs are injuring and killing people. As a scientist who has studied AIDS for 20 years, I have determined that AIDS has little to do with science and is not even primarily a medical issue. AIDS is a sociological phenomenon held together by fear, creating a kind of medical McCarthyism that has transgressed and collapsed all the rules of science and has imposed a brew of belief in pseudoscience on a vulnerable public. And mind you, this was a mainstream scientist within the AIDS community whose very drugs were used by hundreds of thousands of people until he looked for the truth. This is from Dr. Donald W. Miller, medical doctor, Harvard University, Dartmouth, and professor, University of Washington School of Medicine. Quote, AIDS is a government-defined disease. The CDC and the government-funded investigators accept as fact the supposition that AIDS is caused by HIV and is sexually transmitted. This is not to be questioned, but this HIV equals AIDS model does not jibe with the true facts of the matter. Only 1 in 1,000 unprotected sexual contacts transmits HIV, and only 1 in 275 U.S. citizens has antibodies to the virus. Consequently, the average uninfected person would need to have 275,000 random unprotected sexual contacts to acquire sexually transmitted HIV. And finally, just on the politics of this, we have Tony Brown, one of the most courageous and ethical journalists in the United States. He is also the founding dean of the School of Communication at Howard University, and he is coordinator of the historic Walk to Freedom March with Martin Luther King Jr., and of course he's the PBS show Tony Brown's Journal. Quote, "The greatest threat to life in the United States and the rest of the world is not the 30 diseases we call AIDS. It is the multi-billion-dollar AIDS industry composed of government, academic, medical, and industrial interests in the United States. I've concluded that AIDS is a scientifically dishonest construct, and as exemplified in the death of my friend Arthur Ashe, the lies that we have been told make it all the more deadly." On Dr. Robert Gallo, these are the views of individuals who have not been invited on public television, where that would be the most appropriate forum to challenge Dr. Gallo. Dr. Gallo deserves every opportunity to defend himself in any court of public opinion or any other jurisdiction. Therefore, allow Gallo and his detractors an opportunity to face each other and let the audience decide who is correct. Here is Dr. Joseph Sonnabend. He is a founder of the American Foundation for AIDS Research, AMFAR. Quote, "Gallo was certain, but the point is not to focus on Gallo. It's us, all of us in the scientific community. We let him get away with it. Nobody would say a word against Gallo. It had a lot to do with patriotism, the idea that this great discovery was made by an American." By Dr. Michael Lang, MD, head of AIDS program, St. Luke's Hospital. Quote, "I was very upset. The cause of AIDS was discovered by government fiat. I've been working with the Pasteur Institute for 6 months, but then the Gallo announcement was made at a press conference. As far as I'm concerned, from that point on, AIDS research turned into seedy criminal politics, and it remains that way. I was far from convinced by the data that they had then, and I'm still not convinced. We were all forced into a very dogmatic and simplistic view of what caused AIDS. Today, I think that even the greatest proponents of HIV no longer believe that it does all the damage to the immune system by itself. There have to be other factors involved. And because the HIV hypothesis, there has been little or no research done on what other factors may cause AIDS." We have Dr. Jens Gernald, MD, Doctor of Science, former professor of philosophy and principles, and he says the following: "HIV is totally unrelated to disease or loss of immunity. AIDS is not an infectious disease. Robert Gallo and his HIV equals AIDS hypothesis club are unscientific quacks, as I've been alleging since 1988. Is AIDS an epidemic? Again, a strong and unconditional no. Of course, it is relatively easy to fake one. Opportunistic infections of diseases are always the real cause of death in people with weakened immunity. The statistics can be manipulated by lumping an ever-increasing number of these cases together under the heading of AIDS. HIV exists, so does AIDS, but the two are no way connected. Our definitive conclusions at this time: AIDS is the hoax of the century." Dr. William Godschalk, PhD biochemist, The Hague, formerly assistant professor, University of Virginia Medical School, and associate professor, University of Puerto Rico's Medical School, senior scientist at the Center for Energy and Environmental Research. Gallo had a press conference in 1984, declared that a new retrovirus, which he claimed to have discovered in a small number of AIDS patients, was the probable cause of AIDS. The new retrovirus was permanently named the human immunodeficiency virus. The word probable was soon forgotten, never to be admitted again. Margaret Heckler proclaimed, quote, "Today we add another miracle to the long honor roll of American medicine and science," unquote. The cause of AIDS has been established by government decree. The cause of AIDS has been established by government decree and not by independent scientific research and consensus. Incredible as it may sound to most, it is a fact that there is no proof whatsoever of HIV causing AIDS in spite of the ever-present dogmatic pounding of all these years by the media and the phrase HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. Directly after the press conference, Gallo patented his method for testing against HIV antibodies, which has since made him a multimillionaire. As will be explained in the following, the test is not only grossly inadequate and totally unnecessary, but turns into an insidious death trap for those who happen to test positive. And a few more here. And this is one of the most respected scientists in the world. This is a man with hundreds of peer-reviewed papers. This is a man who has a reputation as a leading virologist and also one of the world's 5 leading experts on how to use the electron microscope, and he's done so thousands of times. Professor Emeritus, University of Toronto, Professor Emeritus, Sloan Kettering, Dr. de Harven. Here's what he says on the HIV isolation, the very issue that Janine Roberts is saying, quote, "I have never observed one single particle of retrovirus in any of the thousands of samples of human leukemic, cancers, and AIDS-related samples. I studied under the electron microscope for more than 40 years. In my judgment, the very existence of the so-called HIV has never been scientifically demonstrated. We all harbor in our genome sequences of endogenous retroviruses that do not have any known pathogenicity and therefore should not, under any circumstances, be called HIV, since that name implies pathology. HIV has been fraudulently invented for the monumental financial profit of the pharmaceutical industry. Highly toxic anti-HIV drugs have been and still are responsible for the death of innumerable patients," unquote. Quote, "Dominated by the media, by pressure groups, and by the interests of pharmaceutical companies, the AIDS establishment lost control with open-minded, peer-reviewed science. The unproven HIV equals AIDS hypothesis received 100% of the research funds, while all other hypotheses were ignored," unquote. From Dr. Rosalind Harrison, Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons and the National Health Service from your country, quote, "Virus isolation is necessary to prove virus infection. Retroviruses have laid down a set of criteria to distinguish spurious from genuine retroviruses. HIV does not fulfill these criteria." And also one of the very first scientists around the world who came forward and said, "Hold on, you've got it wrong." And this is a woman who's asked multiple times to come to America to debate. No one has taken her up. And what I am also going to tell you is that every opportunity that we have had to debate the pro-HIV hypothesis people, they have rejected those debates. Even when I took a camera crew to Geneva to World Congress on HIV, and in the public section where you're allowed to go up to a microphone and ask a question, they refused to answer our questions, dismissing us out of hand. And we took leading professors of our own question from anyone involving this. Here's what this great Dr. Papadopoulos Eliopoulos, she's a biophysicist, professor of medical physics, Royal Perth Hospital, University of Western Australia. Quote, "There is no proof that HIV causes AIDS, for many reasons, but most importantly because there is no proof that HIV exists. Let me repeat, there is no question of isolation. Gallo did not isolate a virus. There was no electron microscope pictures of a banded specimen that one would expect to show nothing but retroviral particles. The HIV antibody test did not detect a virus. The fact is that an antibody test, even if repeated and found positive 1,000 times, does not prove the presence of viral infection." Professor of Pathology, Professor of Medicine, University of British Columbia, Professor James Hudson. Quote, "I stopped going to AIDS meetings several years ago. I could no longer stand the stress of restraining myself from getting up and shouting rubbish. None of these investigators isolated actual viruses or viral genomes. All they do is add some primers to a PCR mixture and pretend that the printout represents HIV genomes. None of this has been proven, and furthermore, the PCR technique was never conceived as a quantitative measure of anything. In view of this, we should always qualify our usage of the term viral load. Otherwise, we fall into the trap of subscribing to their hypothetical nonsense. I do not believe there is an AIDS epidemic in Africa or Asia. People there are still dying from the combined effects of chronic infectious diseases plus malnutrition, poverty, and other factors, just as they always have. One more. And this is from the co-founder of the HIV virus, the virologist, Pasteur Institute, Dr. Luc Montagnier. Quote, AIDS does not inevitably lead to death, especially if you suppress the cofactors that support the disease. It is very important to tell this to people who are infected. I think we should put the same weight now on the cofactors as we do on HIV. Psychological factors are critical in supporting immune function. If you suppress the psychological support by telling someone he's condemned to death, your words alone will condemn him. We did not purify, isolate the virus. We saw some particles, but they did not have the morphology, meaning shape, typical of retroviruses. They were very different. What we did not have, as I have always recognized, is that it was truly the cause of AIDS. Now, mind you, the co-founder didn't isolate it. Why, then, have we gone on this way? One other personal observation before I go over to Manette Loudon, who will be reading this. We have more than 2,000 outstanding scientists, Nobel Prize winners, professor emerituses in virology, molecular biology, public health, who all are so outraged that they're willing to go on the record and risk their reputations. I believe that says something. They want a debate. They want to have testimony. And yet, no one has invited them to do so. So we are presenting some of their views now. But all 2,000 of their views are on my website, their credentials, their background, and their statements. For the average person who is easily misled, for the average legislator, also equally misled, understand this about AIDS in Africa. And please share this if anyone knows him with Bill Gates or Bill Clinton, because their efforts could help so much to correct what is wrong in Africa and save lives. Through their foundations and their pharmaceutical company contacts, giving expensive drugs is not the answer. Let's just use one example. Let's use South Africa, the largest country there. You have the largest identified number of people suffering from HIV infection and AIDS in Africa. You have a large African group of industrialists, multinationalists, financiers. They have no AIDS. You have, living in that same area, the mercantile groups, people who own their own businesses, successful business people, no AIDS. You have a large bureaucracy, school teachers, police officers, firefighters, medics, bureaucrats, no AIDS. You have a large professional class, doctors, engineers, professors, accountants, no AIDS. And then you have a field that's about a mile wide, mile and a half. And there you have one of the largest ghettos in Africa. And there you have an epidemic of AIDS. Now just use common sense, no science. How smart would this virus be that it would skip over you if you're an industrialist, a banker, a police officer, or a professor, and infect you only if you live in this ghetto? And that is what AIDS is in Africa. Massive poverty.
Add something there,
Because this is the difference. Show me the people in our AIDS establishment. Show me the people making the $1 million, $100 million grant. Show me the people looking for vaccines who have gone to Africa, spent time there, lived there, researched there, as my guest, Janine Roberts, has done. Tell us your personal experience.
I went out to South Africa just over a year ago to do the research on AIDS. And I was absolutely astonished to find that the population of Africa south of Sahara has doubled during the AIDS epidemic. That's totally contrary to everything I'd learnt. Then a doctor said to me, do you know they diagnose AIDS differently in Africa from how they do it in the United States? And I was shocked. I mean, you can't diagnose a disease differently and give it the same name. And they said, well, it's easy to discover it. Go to the World Health Organization, and they've put it on their website, how to diagnose AIDS in Africa. Well, I know Times journalists, many leading journalists, and I asked them, and they said, no, rubbish, no. They can't do it differently in Africa. Well, they do. They've got up on their website, anyone can go to the World Health Organization website and look up what's called a diagnostic definition of AIDS for Africa. It's called the Bangui definition. And it says that Africans have to score 12 points and need not be proved HIV positive. If they've got diarrhea for a month, that counts as 4 points. Impure water supplies. If consequent to having diarrhea for a month, they've got 10% weight loss, 4 points. Intermittent fever, 4 points. Dermatitis, a skin rash, 3 points. Okay, here's an African. 60% of the Africans live in such poverty south of Sahara that they do not have pure water supplies. That would give them diarrhea, that would give them weight loss, that would give them dermatitis, that would give them intermittent fevers. But this is down, it's on the South African diagnostic documents given to their doctors, same documents given out in Kenya, same documents given out in Uganda. It's all set out, tick, tick, tick the boxes, score 12 points, this African has got AIDS. You then tell them, a young man, young woman, and you say, you have got a sexually transmitted, which often means lots of guilt, disease, and you're surely going to die unless you can persuade your government to purchase very expensive American drugs. Most of these drugs are making $1 billion a year for American companies. It's just inconsequential. We've got a different diagnosis for Africa. It's stupid. But then if you go to the Centers for Disease Control in Washington and look up the rules for diagnosis of AIDS, it also lists ways of diagnosing AIDS in the HIV negative. There's about 12 different ways of being found to have AIDS in the United States without being HIV positive. And at the same time, they say HIV is necessary for AIDS. I do not understand my own profession. I don't understand why my fellow journalists do not go to the World Health Organization to find out how to diagnose AIDS in Africa. It's simply presumed and logical. They think they do it the same as they do it in the United States. But you know, it was politically necessary in a way because viruses are gender neutral in who they infect men and women likewise. So, if it wasn't for Africa, we'd have to say that AIDS is a male disease, because AIDS is nearly totally striking down men and not women. They conceal this by giving figures and percentages, but when you get the actual statistics, I'm from the UK, last year's government figures, 47 women and 5,000 men. Also in Africa, the World Health Organization, to save money, extrapolates from the figures that they've done at at the clinic. We know from the manufacturers of the HIV test that pregnancy is a risk factor for testing positive. So they take the figures from the pregnancy clinics in South Africa and they multiply them up to make a figure for the entire country. And yet, currently, the South African government lists AIDS right down below about 5 or 6 other diseases as a killer in Africa. This has outraged the AIDS lobby. And now claiming all the people dying of TB are dying of AIDS in order to be able to say that and TB is a big killer. So they're fixing the figures. I went to the stage I stayed with other journalists in Johannesburg. I had the Times antiretroviral drugs, and we come out to give them to Africans. And I thought, well, what do I say? I don't want to start a big argument. So I simply cited a professor at Harvard who has reported that microbacteria test positive for HIV. And the reaction was, what you say? What's that? And I said, well, the theory of AIDS demands that. And he said, you said the theory. She says the theory. And it was like I was being ridiculed for quoting a Harvard University